Professor Shiv Kumar, Dr. Subramanya, faculty and students. I think all of you, most of you, are born after 1991. Am I right? And therefore, I was asked actually by Rajiv Gowda, who's not here, who will be here presently, to speak to you on a bit of economic history as to how India came to be what it is today. And I'll spend a few minutes with you, and we'll have more time for interactions and questions and answers rather than my making a long formal speech. But all of you, of course, since you are the post-91 generation in many ways, are used to thinking of India in a different way than perhaps I was used to, or Dr. Subramanya and Professor Shivakumar have been used to. It was a different India altogether. The assumptions, the foundations of India's economic policy underwent a radical transformation in 1991. And the reason why it went a transformation in 1991 was because we faced an unprecedented foreign exchange crisis. We did not have enough foreign exchange to survive for even a week. Actually, we had enough foreign exchange only for about 5 days of imports. If you open the newspapers today, the Economic Times or any of the economic papers, you will read that today India's foreign exchange reserves are at $430 billion. $430 billion. On the 21st of June 1991, when the government came to power of Mr. Narasimha Rao and Dr. Manmohan Singh, the foreign exchange reserves of India was $900 million. So we've gone from $900 million to $430 billion. And this is the story of the transformation of India over the last 25 or 26 years. But to understand the India that we are living in today, an India that is growing at 7.5%, an aspirational India, an India that has a completely new complexion both to itself and to the rest of the world, it's important to understand a little bit of economic history. Between 1900 and 1950, between 1900 and 1950, the first 50 years of the 20th century, India's economy grew at about 0.5% per year. It grew at 0.5% per year. Remember that every year our population was also increasing. Between 1900 and 1950, our population was increasing by something like 2.5% per year. So if the economy is growing by 0.5% per year, and the population is growing by 2.5% per year, it means that per capita income is actually coming down. So between 1900 and 1950, when the British ruled us, India's economy stagnated at about 0.5%, but India's per capita income actually declined over 50 years. And that's the story of the India that was inherited by our founding fathers, whom we all abuse day in and day out. This was the India that was inherited in 1950. Now what happened afterwards? From 1950 to 1955, the first 5 years of Indian independence, so to speak, the Indian economy grew at about 3.5% per year. So we went from 0.5% per year to 3.5% per year. It was a huge increase. We were a new country. Partition had taken place. We were still finding our feet. We did not have institutions. The enrollment in higher education was less than 10%. Our literacy rate was no more than 20%. And in this India, we went from 0.5% per year over a 50-year period to growing at 3.5% per year, which was a remarkable transformation. Then, from 1955 to 1960, the next 5 years, we went from growing at 3.5% per year to growing at 4.5% per year. We were no longer growing on a low base. Our base had increased, and on that increased base, we were growing at 4.5% per year. By the beginning of the 60s, India was one of the remarkable success stories of a poor country which had started the process of economic transformation, but in a democratic setup. Remember, the theory of sociology is, if you have democracy, you don't have development. And if you want development, you have to abandon democracy. But India in 1950 said, we want democracy and we want development to go hand in hand. So till 1960, India was a remarkable success story. However, after the 60s, misfortunes piled upon us. And misfortunes never come in ones or twos. Misfortunes come in battalions. We had a war in 1962. Then the monsoon failed. You had famine in this country. 64, 65, 66, 67, 68. None of you will remember, but I remember. And I'm sure Dr. Subramanya and Professor Shivkumar will remember. The situation was so bad that we had a Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, who came on All India Radio. There was no television those days. Who came on All India Radio and said, fellow Indians, miss a meal once a week. क्या आपका idea? Miss a meal once a week. And every Tuesday, I missed a meal. I grew up missing a meal. The Prime Minister also said to the North Indians, eat less rice so that our South Indians can get more rice. And he told the South Indians, eat less rice and eat more wheat. You know, today you can go anywhere in Bangalore and order chapatis. 50 years ago, there were no chapatis in Bangalore. There were no naans, there were no rotis. It was rice, different varieties of rice. And that's it. This is true of Kerala, it was true of Karnataka, it was true of Tamil Nadu. This was the mid-60s. Then what happened? In 1971, we had another war. Sorry, in 65, we had another war. In 71, we had another war. And in 73, the entire economy went into a tailspin because the price of oil shot up 3 times. So by 1960, we were a success story. By the mid-70s, things had become very dark and bleak for us. And it's only subsequent to that we started taking small steps to come back to normalcy. It took almost 10 to 15 years for the economy to recover from the drought and from the wars of the 60s and 70s. None of you will remember this, but we should never forget that any country that depends on other countries to feed itself has no self-pride and no dignity. We were dependent on wheat imports from America. We were dependent on rice imports from Burma. The monsoons failed. The Burmese did not give us rice. The Americans did not give us wheat. And that's when the government of the day decided that we must stand on our own 2 feet and learn to feed ourselves. And today, India is the world's second largest wheat producer. It's the second largest rice producer. We export rice, we export wheat. And that's the measure of the self-confidence that India has developed over the last 25, 30 years. So by the 80s, India had begun to change. The nightmare that we went through in the 60s and 70s was giving way to new confidence. And by the early 1980s, the government felt confident enough to open the economy a little. You don't remember, but the old-timers remember. There were only 2 cars in India till 1985. One was this rickety car called an Ambassador. And the Ambassador was a miracle of a car. How it moved, only God knew. But it moved. And there used to be another car which was slightly better looking, which everybody wanted to ride. But since the production was limited, you had to wait 20 years for that car. That was a Fiat car. I remember my father waiting for 18 years to get a Fiat car. So he didn't want to ride in an Ambassador car. So the government felt confident enough that India is changing and we need to open up. And in 1983, the first Maruti car came on the roads. And that opened up the economy gradually. Things began to change. In the India of the 70s, the most valuable item of dowry in an Indian family was a Bajaj scooter. It no longer is, thank God. But there was a time when the value of a dowry was measured in terms of whether you give your prospective son-in-law a Bajaj Chetak. And in fact, the advertisements for Bajaj Chetak, quite obnoxiously, was, this is the premium dowry product, if you go back to the advertisements of the 70s. So by the end 80s, India was growing at about 5.5% per year. And by 1990, which nobody will tell you, but which you must remember, by 1990, per capita income in India was higher than the per capita income of China. Today, we all look to China with great admiration. Our Prime Minister today is taking a cruise with his Chinese president. Everybody looks at China as the economic miracle. But friends, till 1990, India's per capita income, in spite of all the turbulence and vicissitudes of the 60s and the 70s, India's per capita income in 1990 was higher than the per capita income of China. But then we ran into this huge foreign exchange crisis. Price of oil went up. The Gulf War happened. We had to repatriate a lot of people from Gulf, from Kuwait, back to India. Our exports did not grow. We had to mortgage gold. And the bottom line of all this, to cut a long story short, was that our foreign exchange reserves fell, as I explained to you, to $900 million. And that's when the government, of which Mr. Narasimha Rao was the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister, said, this is an opportunity for us not to carry out partial surgery, but to carry out complete surgery. Not to give the Indian economy a homeopathic dose, but to give the Indian economy a massive allopathic dose. And that's what happened in 1991. The Indian economy opened up completely. Trade became freer. The dollar became freer vis-a-vis the Indian rupee. The licensing controls were removed. And an economy that was growing at about 5.5% per year started growing first at 6.5%, and over the last 10 years, it has grown at 7.5%. So this is a broad view of where India has come to today. We are the world's third largest economy, measured in terms of purchasing power parity. We're still a poor country because our denominator is very big, because our per capita income is low, because our denominator is very big and it's keeping increasing every year. However, we are the world's third largest economy. We are the fastest growing democracy. And these are not achievements of 1 year or 2 years. These are not achievements of one individual, however charismatic and however eloquent that individual may be. But these are achievements of a cumulative set of actions over the past few decades. The city in which all of you are studying, Bangalore, today the icons of Bangalore are the Infosys and the Wipros. But how do you think the Wipros and the Infosys became the Infosys and the Wipros? Bangalore became a global dynamo because of the huge public investment that was made in Bangalore in the 50s, in the 60s and the 70s. The HMTs, the BHELs, the Bharat Electronics, of course the Indian Institute of Science predated the 50s, but the growth of the Indian Institute of Science and a large number of academic and scientific institutions created an ecosystem which enabled the new generation entrepreneurs like Narayan Murthy, Azim Premji and very many other people to take advantage of this ecosystem and create this global city in which you are all studying. So even the roots of Bangalore are not some miraculous development. It's the roots of Bangalore also go back to a time when public investment took place, particularly in science, education, technology. And it was a time in which science was valued. It was in India in which Darwin was not dismissed as a hoax. It was in India in which Einstein was recognized as the author of the theory of relativity. And nobody said that what Einstein had discovered was known to the Indians 1500 years ago. That was the spirit of science. And that was reflected in this city. And this city then became the global engine. So we are today at a remarkable point of time. We are a democracy. We value our democracy. We are a young country The median age in India is 28 years old. We will continue to remain a young country. And while most countries in the world are facing stagnant or declining populations, India's population is continuing to increase. We are today 1.25 billion people, and we will be 1.7 billion by the middle of the century. So there is a demographic momentum, a young population, an educated population, an urban population, an aspirational population can also be an asset. Of course, increase in population can also create huge problems for infrastructure. But if harnessed, demography can also be a source of economic growth and investment, which India has found to its advantage. So we are at a remarkable point of time, and we have come to this after a long period of twists and turns. We have come to this after a long period of infrastructure building. We have come to this situation after a very long period where foundations were created. But most important, and this is the most important message that I want to leave with you, we have come to this recognizing the value of democratic systems and recognizing the value of accepting, tolerating, and celebrating our diversity. Our motto of the Indian state, unlike that of the United States, when you look at the American eagle, and I'm sure, of course, you're not in an engineering college. In an engineering college, you know, my definition of an engineering college is a student joins an engineering college. The body is in the college, but the soul has already migrated to the US. The legal students, I think, are in a better position. Most of you will work in India, and very few of you will actually want to go and migrate. But if you look at that eagle, the bald eagle of the United States, below it is written E pluribus unum. It's the Latin for out of many, one. That's the American motto, out of many, one. The Indian motto is not E pluribus unum. It's actually E pluribus pluribus, out of many, even more. That's our society. There is no society in the world that is as diverse as our society. Religion, caste, region, language. There's no country which has 22 official languages. 22 official languages recognized by the Constitution of India. And we are not managing diversity the Chinese way, which is to make everybody uniform. We are not managing diversity the American way, which is to create out of this diversity one entity called an American. We are managing this diversity the Indian way, the democratic way, giving space to everybody to have an equal and dignified place in society, and basically practice whatever religion, speak whatever language, belong to whatever region, eat whatever you want, but follow democratic procedures and democratic norms. And I think that's the greatest achievement of India is we have not had the spectacular growth of China, but we've had steady and increasing growth. But unlike China, and unlike most countries in the world, we have maintained our democratic systems. And people today have a greater stake and vested interest in deepening our democracy. And democracy doesn't just mean electing prime ministers and chief ministers. Democracy also means the millions of elected representatives in local bodies. How many of you know that today we have 3 million Indians elected, 3 million Indians elected to local bodies, out of whom 46% are women. It's a remarkable achievement. People have voted them into local bodies in urban areas, local bodies in rural areas, and this is the base of our democracy. The headlines are taken by the prime ministers and the chief ministers, but the base of Indian democracy is in the panchayats, is in the municipal corporations, is in the wards, are in the blocks, and there are 3 million of them who day in and day out are deepening our democratic edifice. So let me leave what I had to say formally to you. You belong to a generation that has been born in a different India. I happen to be born in an India that made the transition. So I have memories of what India was. I would urge each one of you to read about economic history, more about the debates that took place in this country, why India adopted a particular economic model in the 50s, the strengths that it had, the weaknesses that it had, and what happened to India that led it to bring about this paradigm shift in 1991, the results of which you are all seeing in terms of aspiration and economic development. So let me wish you all the very best. How many of you are from outside the state? Just to get a sense of, wow, about 40%. About 40%. 40% of you are from outside. And how many of you will come back to teaching law? Nobody. I think you should give a special award to all those who are holding up their hands for teaching law. How many of you will stay in India? Now, that's the difference between an engineering college and a law college. So let me thank all of you. Let me wish you all the very best. And if you have any questions, I'm ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that influential message. Your speech was full of enthusiasm and knowledge. We were able to understand what India was post-independence and how we came to what we are today and the development that's happened to the past 30 years. Thank you so much, sir. And now we have an interactive session with the students. The students have the freedom to ask questions to sir.
Are we starting? Who is going to ask the first question?
First of all, thanks for your lecture. It was amazing. I really liked it. My name is Vinay. And the question is, someone mentioned here that you were responsible for inventory with regards to climate change, right? What was that inventory? I mean, what was your regards to that?
Well, area of climate. And I think Bangalore is a wonderful place to experience this, because I'm sure Professor Shivkumar will remember a Bangalore where fans were never used and air conditioners were a rarity. But you see what has happened even in a city like Bangalore. It's supposed to be naturally air conditioned. World is undergoing global warming. And what is global warming? To put it very simply, imagine the earth and imagine a gigantic blanket, a razai, which is enveloping this earth. What is going to happen? This razai is allowing certain radiation in, but is not allowing certain radiation out. So the earth is warming. This Razai is not made out of wool, it's made out of carbon dioxide and methane and a few other gases which are called global warming gases. Now how is it coming? It's coming because of human activity. It's coming because of power plants putting out CO2. It's coming because of our transport putting out carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide. It's coming out from our air conditioning, which is putting out greenhouse gases. So over the past 150 years, the earth began to warm and temperatures began to increase. And somewhere in the early 90s, the world community said, we need a global agreement to control global warming. What was India's position? Indians always liked themselves to think that they are unique. And so in the world community, India's position was, we did not cause global warming. You guys, the white guys, you are the guys who put all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You take it out. We have to grow because we have so many poor people. We have to provide electricity. We need economic growth. So we did not cause the problem of global warming. You find a solution, and when you find a solution, call us and we'll get back to you. That was India's position for 15 years. Backing India's position was a very simple arithmetic calculation. Everything per capita in India is very low. Why? Because the denominator is very big. Anything divided by 1.25 billion will always be very low. And not only is it 1.25 billion, but it is a denominator that is increasing by 10 million every year. So per capita emissions are very low. Per capita emissions in America, 15 tons per capita. Per capita emissions in Europe, 8 tons per capita. And India told the world, our per capita emissions are only 1 ton. Why are you worried? You are the guys who are creating all this problem. You find a solution and then we'll worry about it later. This was India's position. When I became the minister in 2009, I found that this position was bizarrely irrational. Why? Because India may not have caused global warming, but India was facing the consequences of global warming like no other country in the world. Our monsoon was becoming unpredictable. Our glaciers in the Himalayas were retreating. Our forests were vanishing. Sea levels along the 7,500 kilometer long coastline extending from West Bengal on the east to Gujarat in the west, mean sea levels were increasing, bringing into threat people living in coastal areas. And we continue to say that we are not concerned with global warming. So my position was that India may not have caused the problem, but we have to be part of the solution. Why? Not because we are, great altruists or anything, but because we are suffering already the consequences of global warming. So that's the shift that I tried to bring about in 2009, for which I was bitterly criticized. But I'm very glad that the people who criticized me then have now become the greatest champions of whatever I said then, but they were not willing to accept. So India signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, and the Paris Agreement in 2015 was virtually the same agreement that was negotiated. The structure of that agreement was what was negotiated in Copenhagen in 2009, for which I was accused of bartering away India's sovereignty and becoming, a slave to the Western world. But 6 years later, when this is an old rule of parliamentary politics, where you stand depends on where you sit. So those who were sitting in the opposition then came to power and realized what havoc global warming was causing, and they went and signed the Paris Agreement. Very good. That was the change that was needed. But the feeling in India was our per capita emissions are low. We did not put out all the carbon dioxide. The Western countries should do that. And if we do anything, our economic development objectives would be jeopardized. All those assumptions were questioned. And I'm glad today in our country, people are more conscious of climate change than they ever were. And I'm glad that the Prime Minister and his colleagues are actually saying climate change is a big, huge concern for this country. And I think that's a change that has come about in the last 10 years in India.
Everyone, I'm Nima, a Tibetan student of CMR Law College. Sir, I would like to... Hello. Can you hear me, sir? Yes. I'm so inspired by your great work, and thank you so much for being here. So my question is, the rapid growth of China's global domination could be a big threat to the national interest of India. Do you think so? And how Tibetan cause can play an important role for India to challenge it?
We've had a blow hot, blow cold relationship with China over 3,000 years. We've had long periods of interaction between India and China. In the 6th century, 7th century AD, Buddhism took root in China thanks to scholars who went to India and Chinese scholars who came to India. And those of you who have read Indian history books will remember Xuanzang, who came to India, Fahian, who came to India. So we have had Rabindranath Tagore started a China Bhavan in Shantiniketan in the 30s. Nehru, Gandhi, they were all conscious of the fact that India and China were two neighboring countries, separated only by the Himalayas, who will have to work peacefully with each other. But then we fought a war in 1962. And India was humiliated in the war. And the long ghost of 1962 is there in every Indian. So we look upon China very suspiciously, and the Chinese look upon India equally suspiciously. With the growth of the internet, there is only one thing more dangerous than nationalism. It is cyber nationalism. So you have a large army of cyber nationalists in India, and you have a large army of cyber nationalists in China. The fact of the matter is, India and China account for 40% of the world's population. India and China, like a Chinese Prime Minister once said, have lived with each other in peace for 99.3% of the time, but only for 0.7% they've had problems with each other. There is a border problem between India and China, no doubt. But India and China have to find a way of living with each other peacefully, without confrontation, recognizing that China is different politically, China is different socially, and India is different. The Chinese don't want to be like India, and India doesn't want to be like China. But for India, China is a reality. For China, India is a reality. And India and China have to stop looking at each other through the eyes of a third party. We look upon the Chinese through the eyes of the Americans or the Japanese, because very few people in India know Chinese language. We read the English language press about China, which makes India and China to be natural competitors. So one of the things that I have been involved in for the last couple of years, almost for 20 years, is to find ways and means of bringing India and China together, to multiply the points of contact. In fact, many years ago, I coined a word for which I was criticized then, Chindia. China plus India is equal to Chindia. I mean, China and India are not going to be allies. They cannot be allies, but they can understand each other. They can live with each other. They can trade with each other. They can have people-to-people exchange with each other. And the fact that they are both nuclear powers means that they cannot fight a war anymore with each other. So it's an extraordinarily complex relationship. And I think the biggest challenge for any Indian Prime Minister or Indian government is how do you manage the relationship with China.
Thomas, and I'm a student of the 3 years LLB program. And it's an honor for me to be in your company once again. So my question to you here is quite simple. You very well substantiated that democracy and development have to go hand in hand. But my question is more specific with respect to how and what kind of an impact will developmental activities have on environment, and where law can play a proactive role there. So we already have a lot of special economic zones in India, and I very clearly remember when you were in charge of Ministry of Environment and Forests, you didn't easily grant ECs. So
I'm glad you asked this question, because we are, from a law point of view, one of the more progressive nations in the world. And for that we have to thank the then Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, who created this edifice of laws, a wildlife protection law, air pollution control law, a water pollution control law, a forest conservation law, and then finally in 1986 came the Environment Protection Act. So from a legal point of view, from a legal structure point of view, there are no shortage of laws, no shortage of regulations. But as it so often happens in our country, the enforcement of the laws becomes a huge issue. In fact, somebody once said very rightly that Indians take great delight in passing laws, but greater delight in bypassing them. So you have this huge legal edifice for water pollution, for air pollution, for forest conservation, for wildlife protection, but a reluctance to enforce them, because enforcing laws means attacking some vested interest or the other. So it's very difficult to find instances where the law has actually been enforced without fear or favor. The same, I think, Professor Subramania mentioned the example of the Land Acquisition Act. Same thing happened in the case of the Land Acquisition Law. When I became the Minister in Rural Development, there was a big furor in this country that the land acquisition law that we had goes back to the principle of eminent domain. And all of you know what the principle of eminent domain is. The 1894 land acquisition law believed that the state can acquire whatever land at whatever cost, at whatever price, at whatever time, for whatever purpose, from whoever it wanted. I mean, that was the law we had. And that got replaced, thankfully, with participation of all political parties in 2013 September by the new land acquisition law. And as he mentioned, I think those of you who are interested in the process of legal, how laws are made and what the trade-offs have to be, are there, should read this book on the making of the Land Acquisition Act. Incidentally, I had a number of lawyers working with me, young lawyers. One of my key aides was from the National Law School in Calcutta, one of Professor Subramania's students. And I always used to say that, I had 4 or 5 young legal brains drafting the law, and somebody asked me, what is your role? And my role was to translate whatever they wrote into English. And that's how the law was actually made. Because one of the things law schools don't teach you is how to draft simple, understandable laws. And I hope that you will graduate from here with a better understanding of a law that is written simply. In fact, laws are not written simply deliberately. Because if laws are written simply and laws are written in a clear and precise manner, unemployment rate in lawyers would zoom. Lawyers will make a killing if the laws, and land acquisition law was a perfect example of this. So many provisos, so many clauses, so much of opacity in the law in the 1894 Act, which had to be changed in the 2013 law. So same thing with the environment. We have the laws. There's no shortage of laws. You don't need a new set of laws. What you need really is enforcement. And the question is, how do you enforce the laws? Do you enforce it administratively, or do you enforce it in a market-friendly manner? And I think that's the big debate that is now engaging the country, that laws are fine, but laws should not be introduced or implemented in a manner that leads to rent-seeking, that leads to increasing harassment, that leads to increasing corruption. So we have to find ways and means of enforcing these laws, standards, and regulations without necessarily affecting economic agents and economic behavior. See, the purpose of the law is to give signals to people for, can you hear me? Sorry. The purpose of the law is to give signals to economic agents for behavior. The purpose of the law is to set standards. The purpose of the law is to provide a broad direction. If the law says that by the year 2025, electric vehicles will be used, then you will find a lot of automotive companies investing in better electric vehicles. People are not going to make an investment without some long-term perspective in mind. And I think the purpose of this law that you mentioned and other laws is to create this economic incentive for people to invest more in developing clean technologies. It's world over, the law is seen as an instrument of influencing behavior. And let me give you a couple of examples. Since all of you are lawyers, let me give you an example of how law has overturned entire industries. Sit down. in 1984, there was a very famous judgment of an American judge called Judge Harold Green. And this was an antitrust judgment. And he broke up the company called AT&T. Nobody hears of AT&T now, but in the 1980s, AT&T was the Google and the Facebook of the 1980s, American Telephone and Telegraph Company. AT&T was broken up by the orders of a judge. And the one direct consequence of the breakup of AT&T was the growth of the small telecom companies, who then created this mobile telephony revolution by the mid-90s. So the roots of that go back to a legal judgment. Now, you buy any car, you have a catalytic converter installed in the car. This was not the case 15 years ago or 20 years ago. How do you think it became mandatory for every car to have a catalytic converter? It was a legal judgment again. It was again in the United States where the big three, General Motors, Ford, and American Motors, complained against the laws being enforced for pollution control, and the Supreme Court said catalytic converters is not an infringement on fundamental rights. Catalytic converters leads to clean air, which is a public good, the public good doctrine. And catalytic converters that became essential in all cars. The point I want to make is this: law can be a very powerful instrument for economic transformation. It's not a substitute for economic transformation, but it's a very powerful instrument. And these are two very, very important examples from recent economic history, where the law has been used for driving. Now you see the debate that is taking place on the future of Google, on the future of Facebook. What is the debate? And this is a legal debate, by the way. It's not a technological debate alone. It's a legal debate. Monopoly, control of monopoly. Is it anti-competitive? Is it pro-competitive? Does it lead to increased choice for consumers? So these are fundamentally questions of law. So law plays a very important role. And I think if politicians use 20 cars in their rally, it doesn't make much of a difference. But if the law is not there, then the economic incentive for investment gets lost.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Sunita. I am a 3-year LLB student here in this college. My question to you today is, sir, that just now you told that in 1990s, when our economy faced a grave crisis in the wake of a series of famines and droughts and wars, then after that our economy collapsed and new economic reforms were brought in to restructure the economy. So I want to understand that after that, what steps were taken by the great leaders and economists of our country to ensure that if a similar situation were to happen now, because then also our economy was a predominantly agrarian economy, and now also it is an agrarian economy. So if the similar things were to happen today, our economy would not collapse now.
If I get the direction of your question, it is the fact that we continue to remain an agrarian economy. The fact that we continue to remain an agrarian economy, what steps we are taking to ensure that the agrarian economy does not collapse? Is that the question? Yes. Okay. The nature of the crisis has changed dramatically. It's interesting. The crisis that we faced in the 50s and 60s was a crisis caused by lack of production. It was a deeply production-oriented crisis. We didn't produce enough wheat, we didn't produce enough rice, so therefore we had to import wheat from the United States, we had to import rice from Burma, and we never had enough to feed. Today, our crisis is not a production crisis, it's a distribution crisis. We are producing 100 million tons of rice, we are producing 100 million tons of wheat. However, we still have a large number of people who are unable to access what is being produced. So the nature of the crisis has changed. The nature of the crisis is no longer we are self-sufficient. We are self-reliant. We don't depend on other countries. However, our challenge now is to ensure that what we produce gets out to more and more people, particularly the people who are vulnerable and who do not have purchasing power. And that's why the government passed the National Food Security Act, to give grain at subsidized rates and so on and so forth. The nature of the agrarian crisis today is different than what it was in the 50s and 60s. For one thing, we are more irrigated. At that point of time, irrigation was a very small proportion, hardly 10% of our cultivated area. Today, irrigation accounts for 40% of our cultivated area. So the crisis that you are seeing today is not in the irrigated areas, but you are seeing largely in rain-fed areas, in areas which depend on the monsoon. And because of the problems of climate change, the monsoon itself has become very vulnerable. Also, agriculture as a proportion of GDP has fallen. In 1960 or 1965 or 1970, agriculture as a proportion of GDP accounted for 60%. Today, agriculture as a proportion of GDP is only about 15%. So the crisis, it gets manifested differently. What it was then and India has become more diversified. It's become more industrialized. It's got a bigger service economy. So we are able to absorb the shock much more than, say, we were 35 or 40 years ago. But yes, there are large parts of India which continue to face an agrarian crisis. The fact that we continue to have farmer suicides is a good example. And these are largely in rain-fed areas, largely in areas which are, outside the spread of modern irrigation facilities. Rajasthan, Vidarbha, Northern Karnataka, Telangana, these are the rain-fed areas particularly are vulnerable to the crisis.
Two more questions. First one being, are there right now currently banned cryptocurrency and transactions in India? How would cryptocurrency, affect the economy? And second point being, what is the future of cryptocurrency in the world right now?
But this question I have to pass because I'm still trying to figure out what a cryptocurrency is. I have to admit, I really have to admit, I've asked my son to explain to me, he has tried to explain, I've asked some banker to explain, he's confused me more. I'm still trying to figure out what a cryptocurrency is. But I am encouraged by the fact that there is no great desire on the part of anybody in this country to embrace cryptocurrency for the simple reason that we don't have any currency at all in our country. I owe you an answer. I'll give you an answer.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Pratyay. Thank you for your speech, sir. Sir, as you stated in your speech that we are very privileged to live in a democratic society. But sir, there have been instances where the very functioning of democracy has been tarnished. So one of them being the Padma.
Now, we are going cryptocurrency, films, we are going off in a completely different direction. But let me say that democracy means not just the freedom of speech. Democracy also means the ability to listen. But in our system, in our country, whether in parliament or outside, It's a one-sided democratic structure we believe in. We want to have the freedom of speech, but we do not have the capacity to listen to the other person's freedom of speech. We don't have the capacity to listen to what the other person has to say. And I think most of these debates that get, many of these debates that get generated, they may have genuine concerns, they may have genuine doubts, but they get magnified. They get magnified because our public discourse in this country encourages divergent views. A coming together. It does not encourage a convergence of views. For, I don't know how many of you are familiar, for many years, there was a very program, before Arnab Goswami became the nation's icon, there was a program on NDTV called The Big Fight. It was a big fight. And I refused to appear on that program on many occasions because I told the anchor, even if all the three of us, and it used to be Mr. Arun Jaitley, Mr. Yechuri and myself, even if we agreed on everything, if we came on big fight, you would ensure that we would end up disagreeing with each other. Because if we agreed, it's a small fight. If we disagreed, it's a big fight. And your TRPs are dependent on how the size of the fight is. Nobody will watch the three of us agreeing, but everybody will get thrills when we are abusing each other, which is what is happening today. So public debate, unfortunately, in this country has become vitiated by name-calling, by sharp partisan on one issue or the other, and we have lost the capacity. We are the country that gave the world the middle path. We are the country that told the world, avoid extremes. But we have forgotten that. We have forgotten the capacity to find the middle path. And so, I don't want to get into the particular issue that you have raised, but it symbolizes public debate in this country. It symbolizes it becoming highly personalized. There was a time in the 50s, for example, when the Constituent Assembly was meeting. I don't know how many of you have read the Constituent Assembly debates. As lawyers, I would urge you, no lawyer is a complete lawyer without reading the Constituent Assembly debates. You must read it because you will understand, only then you will understand how the Indian Constitution came into being. And there were such vociferous debates on every article. On every article there was a debate. People giving one extreme point of view, another extreme point of view, and people like Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, Dr. Ambedkar, trying to find a middle path. Sometimes these people became proponents in the big debate. I'll give you a very good example. There was a big debate in the Constituent Assembly whether to give constitutional status to panchayats. And Dr. Ambedkar, who was piloting the Constitution, said, in famous words, he said that villages in India are dens of ignorance, superstition, discrimination, and communalism. He became party to a debate, and finally somebody else had to find a middle path, and we ended up having Article 40 in the Constitution, which is a directive principle and not really a fundamental right. So if you read the Constituent Assembly debates, you get a sense of how surcharged the debate was. Debate on language, the debate on the Uniform Civil Code, the debate on every article. But people found a way out. People found a middle path. That, if you were to have a Constituent Assembly today, I don't think it will, more than 5 minutes there won't be peaceful discussion. They'll be at each other. But we should thank our stars that we had a Constituent Assembly and we ended up having a constitution. By the way, how many of you have read Granville Austin? Have any of you read Granville Austin? No, this you must read, The Making of the Indian Constitution. You're all lawyers and you must read some of these classics. You must read the Constituent Assembly debates. You must read Granville Austin's The Making of the Indian Constitution. And it tells you what debates took place. Citizenship. Who is an Indian? How is an Indian to be defined? Should he be defined by blood? Should he be defined by place of birth? These are big debates that took place. What should be the safeguards for minorities? How should religious minorities be safeguarded? How should linguistic minorities be safeguarded? How many of you think that Hindi is the national language of India? What is the national language of India? Well, I'm glad you answered that. You ask 8 out of 10 people in this country, they'll say Hindi is the national language of India. Hindi is not the national language of India. Hindi is one of the 22 official languages under Schedule 8 of the Constitution. And for months, there was a debate on whether the Constitution should recognize Hindi as the national language. And finally, you know what the compromise that was struck? In the first line of the Indian Constitution. Do any of you remember the first line of the Indian Constitution? The first line. Yeah, apart from we the people. Do you remember the first line? The substantive part of the Constitution. Do you remember? India, that is Bharat. Do you remember the Constitution? Starts, India, that is Bharat, shall be a union of states. That was the compromise. Bharat was an Indian word. India, people objected to use the word India in the Constitution. Big debate that took place, like we are discussing whether it should be Padmavat or Padmavati. That time there was a big debate whether it should be India or Bharat. So finally the compromise was India, that is Bharat. There is more, what I tried to explain to you, there is more continuity in economic policy than we often take for granted. We often credit it. Economic growth just doesn't happen. It's not a switch. Somebody comes, puts it on, and you get economic growth. Somebody goes away, the switch goes down, and you don't have economic growth. There is a certain continuity of policy. There's a certain continuity of growth that takes place. But, having said this, there could also be sharp discontinuities in economic policy. Famine is not a man-made calamity, but it is a calamity. War is a discontinuity. It can change the nature of economic growth. A major economic reform that happened in 1991, that could transform the pattern of economic growth. Over the last, I would say, over the last 25 years, we've had 5 prime ministers. Mr. Narasimha Rao, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Mr. Deve Gowda, Dr. Manmohan Singh, then Mr. Narendra Modi. 5 prime ministers. But 25 years, no prime minister has tried to make a dramatic U-turn. Every prime minister has tried to put on the accelerator. Sometimes the prime minister has put on a brake. Sometimes some prime minister has put his foot on the clutch to change the gear. But no prime minister has tried to actually say, this road is a wrong road, and I want to take a U-turn, and I want to go on another road. No prime minister has done this. The first time this is actually done was on the 8th of November 2016. That was not a clutch change. It was not a brake failure. It was not an accelerator putting. It was a Muhammad bin Tughlaq, like this, you know. It was a complete U-turn. So demonetization was a complete U-turn. Complete. And today we are still facing the consequences of demonetization. Demonetization was a bad idea implemented terribly. Then you had GST. Very good idea. Welcome idea. Should have been done many years ago. But in the enthusiasm which is natural amongst political leaders to say that, before me nothing, after me nobody, pushed GST in a manner that the system was not able to absorb the shock. And today, people are still, Indians will settle down. I'm sure GST things will take a little time, but the manner in which it got done. So GST, a very good idea, but implemented in a very arbitrary manner. Had these two shocks not taken place, the economy was cruising. It was cruising at between 2004 and 2014, the economy grew at 7.6% per year. So it is natural that it would go up to 8%. But we are now still trying to break the 7.2% barrier. So I've answered your question. Most of what Mr. Modi has done is take what his predecessors had started forward. He has done one thing which none of his predecessors would have even dreamt of, which is demonetization. He has done one thing which his predecessors had thought of, but were not able to implement for a variety of reasons, which is GST. We will take some time. I don't think that the Indian economy is going to get out of this situation very easily. The world markets are not terribly conducive to exports. Investment is still lukewarm. So we are stuck in a 7 to 7.5% growth trajectory for the next 4 to 5 years. After that, I don't know what is going to happen, frankly. It depends on the recovery in the world economy. If the world economy recovers, then I think it will automatically drive the Indian economy also forward. But there are far too many uncertainties. There are far too many uncertainties in the world economy. Sorry, I can't hear you.
The current Prime Minister that threat to Indian economy, like as you said, that the peaceful moves were not implemented properly. So you think that so do you think that the current Prime Minister's threat, because as we can see that the next election can also, a Prime Minister can also come.
You mean in 2019? All depends on you guys.
Good afternoon, sir. My name's Nandan. So everyone seated here is from Professor Rajiv Gowda's side. My question to you is that during your tenure as the Environment Minister, how often did interest groups and experts in the environment sector influence policy making?
Policy making in our country has necessarily to be broad-based. There are two models of policy making. I'm sorry to say this, I'm not picking on the Prime Minister, but demonetization is one model of decision making. You don't consult anybody, you decide on what is good for the country, and you announce your decision. That's a perfectly valid model. But there's another model, which is, for example, the way the Land Acquisition Act was formulated, or many of the environment laws were formulated, where you consult various interest groups, where you put out a law in the public domain to get comments from the public, and then you have widespread political debate in Parliament and outside, and then have lawmaking. Most laws in India go through an extensive process of consultations. It is inherent in our system. It is inherent in our political system. There is consultation within the central government. There is consultation between the center and the states. There is consultation with interest groups. So I think you will see, and my experience has been that greater the consultation, better the finished product. And one thing I will leave with you as budding lawyers, the process is as important as the product. We tend to focus on the product, but it's the process that is equally important. It's the process that gives confidence to the people that they have been consulted. You may not do what people want you to do, but if they have the satisfaction of having been heard, that is itself, consolation for most people. So my view on policy making has been that make the process transparent, make the process consultative, make the process as widespread as possible. And ultimately, you may have in your mind what you want, but going through the process is very important. In the land acquisition law, in the introduction to the book that I wrote, in the introduction, that the land acquisition law is an example of a law that satisfied nobody. But when the law was announced, Medha Patkar opposed it. And FICCI and CII and ASSOCHAM and all the industry associations also opposed it. So if social activists have opposed the law, and if industrialists have also opposed the law must be good. There must be something right. So in lawmaking, one of the tests of a good law is, does it lead to balanced satisfaction? Because you can never satisfy everybody. But does it lead to balanced dissatisfaction? Are all interest groups equally dissatisfied? If all interest groups are equally dissatisfied, lawmaker has done his job. And I think that's a very, very important insight that I got over 8 years of lawmaking. How many of you are familiar with the National Green Tribunal, the NGT, for example? It's another example of a law that went through a lot of process, a lot of consultation, and the NGT now has become very much part of our legal system, although there's a determined effort to remove the NGT after what the notice they gave to Sri Ravi Shankar. But the fact is that in city after city, people are feeling that they now have an institution that they can go to and appeal against decisions of government. So that is again a process of consultations. Somebody asked me a question on whether Mr. Modi will come back on 2019. Let me end this with this one thing. I found, I never ask people, I never go out and tell people vote for A or vote for B. My message always is go out and vote. And it's very astonishing that Bengaluru, highly educated city, a young city, a mobile city, an aspirational city, has a voter turnout which is less than 55%. This does not do justice to South India. This does justice to UP and Bihar, where voter turnout, is 55, 58. But you look at Kerala, for example, voter turnout, many of you are from Kerala here, I find. The voter turnout in Kerala is 88%, 89%. So my only advice to all of you is, whenever you get a chance to vote, go out and vote. Whom you vote for is your prerogative, is your sovereign right. Whom you get mesmerized by and whose rhetoric sways you is up to you. But if you don't go out and vote, then democracy is not going to get strengthened. And one of the great weaknesses of Indian democracy, I've so far talked about the strengths of Indian democracy. one of the weaknesses of Indian democracy is that urban, middle class, educated India does not vote. The poor have a greater stake in our democracy than all of you guys. And me, we are all part of I'm not different from you. I'm part of the same social milieu. We tend to take democracy for granted. And if you don't go out and vote, democracy is not going to survive. So democracy, it depends on people going out and voting. So that's my answer to the question of what's going to happen in 2019. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I'm sure our students would have enjoyed the interactive session. And now I call upon Shri Vijay Praneshwaran, Vice Principal, School of Legal Studies, CMR University, to propose the vote of thanks.
It is indeed a great honor and privilege to be delivering the vote of thanks on this special day. We would like to express our sincere and deepest thanks to our Chief Guest, Shri Jairam Ramesh, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, for addressing us on the current scenario of the country, and that too a very highly intellectual one. Thank you, sir. I request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor M.S. Shivkumar, to present the Chief Guest with a memento as a token of our gratitude. Thank you, sir. We are thankful to our inspiring chairman, Shri K.C. Ramamurthy, IPS retired and Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, for being instrumental in bringing Shri Jairam Ramesh to CMR University. Thank you, sir. We are thankful to Professor M.S. Shivkumar, Vice Chancellor, CMR University, for his guidance and supervision. We are thankful to Dr. Praveen, Registrar, CMR University, for his kind cooperation. We are thankful to Professor S.K. Balraman, Registrar Evaluation, CMR University. We are thankful to Dr. Sanjay Jain, Principal, CMR IT, Dr. Rishikesh, Director, CMR CBS, Professor Suja Bennett, Principal, CMR IMS, Professor M.O. Ravichandar, Director, CMR Life Skills Institute, for their august presence. We thank the members of the print and electronic media for having covered this event. And last but not the least, I thank our beloved students who are a wonderful audience. Thank you.